Okay. The difference between you guys and the people that will probably one day listen to this online is you got the introduction, they will not. This is what happened. You don't know, you have no clue what's going on. So then we shared a lot of very private things here. Nobody will ever hear out there. And then we answer this question, then we come to the introduction. Okay, perfect. So my last game, by the way, I would say was also Sweatshop, because it is an educational game, and it's the only educational game I probably used with students, and they would later on continue playing that game on their own, which is I think also showing me a new way of playing it. I will talk about that game anyway. And you know, and as you can already tell, people come here, and often when it's about video games, with a lot of different ideas, experiences, fears, or hopes, and it is very hard to reach all of them. So please interrupt me and make sure that the topic you're interested in gets space. And that's something the online people can also not do. Which so okay, my video game experience starts in Ecuador. So at that time, I was hired by the Austrian Federal Ministry for Education to do a meta-study on violence and addiction in video games. And the point was, in Austria, we didn't have age rating. We just took the German age rating, but the Germans are really conservative, boring people, as you all might know. Is anybody here German?
I'll challenge you on that one.
No, so the point is, I apologize. So the point is, the German age rating system has a long tradition and is very much focused on a past Second World War understanding of media. So very restrictive age rating systems. And Austria was never that restrictive, but we always got their age rating on our video game boxes, and that also meant that kids couldn't buy certain games. So the Austrian ministry said, you know, should we really just take the Germans, or should we do an own one? Is there even a problem with violence in video games? So I did this study, and I paused the study to do a 3-month-long trip to Ecuador. And so in Ecuador, we went to the Cuyabeno National Forest, which is kind of like part of the Amazon. The interesting thing is we had a guide there, Paolo. And Paolo, I love the rainforest since that trip, and I've been to a lot of rainforests all over the world, but I never found a guide that was like this guy, because he was like moving through the rainforest like a child, completely opened eyes, and he would pretty much show you stuff. You would be in the same space and not see what he would see, and he would introduce you into this world. And he would be also very careful, and he had this enormous knowledge about the plants and animals. So I thought, you know, Paolo might be one of the natives in the rainforest. And I realized there are different tribes that we visited, and he could like talk to all of them. So I wasn't sure. And the last evening, you know, when the Americans give their tips and the Europeans don't, I was like, Paolo, so which tribe do you belong to? He's like, no, I don't belong to any tribe. I'm from Quito, like, you know, the capital. I study economy. I haven't been in rainforest like 5 years ago. And I was shocked, first of all, of course, of my Eurocentrism and naivete about him, but also I wondered how he got all that knowledge. And Paolo's answer to that was quite interesting. He said he got all his knowledge from playing shooters. So what actually happened here is Paolo plays a lot of shooters and developed this view in the world like playing a shooter. So when he goes through the rainforest, he doesn't walk like a native. He doesn't walk like a biologist. He walks like a video game player, and everything that is happening, he's immediately seeing, and the difference is he immediately makes a picture, goes online and checks what that is. And what happened, this guy found new creatures that nobody knew they existed, and he's very known in the university now for finding all these creatures. And I found it really weird that this guy just told me he plays shooters. That's what I made the studies for. And now I see this enormous potential about the way he is approaching the world inside the rainforest. So that at least made me think. Later on, we decided in Austria not to do age rating in violence issues, but we turned it around and thought, let's do age rating in terms of good games, the right age for playing a good game. So we kind of like give a positive assessment for video games. And what we do is we invite kids and players and researchers to look at certain games, discuss them. And I was in a meeting, And who knows what the difference between these two dolphins are?
No, it's fresh and salt water.
Fresh and salt water, exactly. It turned out an 8-year-old would know that, and the 45-year-old researcher didn't know that. And we were talking about the game Zoo Tycoon 2. And the interesting thing that happened here is that's a zoo simulation. Really recommendable. Not on a Mac for a funny reason. You can buy it for $90 on a Mac or for $5 for PC. Microsoft, thank you. And we're already tapping into a little problem here. This is one of the off-the-shelf games. This is not designed for education. This is designed to make money. The interesting thing is they played the game, and it turns out the 45-year-old could not, kind of like they got stuck with 2 dolphins while the other one had a lot of dolphins, and he was like, how do you make them make more dolphins? And what he didn't find out is that certain dolphins are not happy if there's not the right salt amount in the water. And the only way to realize that is there is the Microsoft Encarta included in the game, and the kids studied everything about the dolphins and knew everything about every creature in the zoo, while the adult kind of like skimmed through it and thought, you know, it's like just an easy task. And I thought, you know, kind of like these 2 experiences in a very short amount of time made me realize I don't care about the violence discussion. I'm really interested in the learning discussion because I see way more potential here for something interesting to happen than in the violence discussion, which is fine if some other people can do that. The interesting thing, though, for me was, so now that you have these people that play Zoo Tycoon and have all this knowledge about animals, in the meanwhile, they don't feed their hamster. Because, you know, they get addicted to the game, they play a lot. The interesting question for me is, so you play this game, you learn all about animals, but can you really apply it to school? Does it make you better in biology? Does it make you better in handling animals? Does it make you a better person? And that are the questions that really come to the core of what I'm interested in. And by the way, we really don't know. We just know that it seems right now that video game players learn a lot that nobody cares about. And there is enormous potential lying out there that is not used yet. And maybe for good reasons. So that's pretty much what we're going to talk about today. But just as a general introduction, in Austria and Germany, the first thing you find if somebody writes a thesis, they always quote Schiller. And you have this funny saying where, you know, man only plays when in the full meaning of the word, he is a man and he's only completely a man when he plays. Beside the, you know, gender problem here, the interesting thing is that in abstract later, Schiller says, by the way, I don't mean board games, card games, or like what the stupid people play. I mean the play of thought. I mean the play of creativity. So Schiller is a really bad example to explain why play is important for humans, beside, of course, the play of mind. So a more interesting approach is the one from anthropology, when you realize, yes, humans are definitely born unfinished. So it turns out if you let a small baby alone in a jungle, it will probably, beside some of them that get kind of like educated by animals, most of them die. While a lot of animals out there, after a very short amount of time, are kind of like able to live or survive. Humans are, in their nature, unfinished. And the interesting thing about that is that we need to develop our pretty much essential skills through a long, long time. I'm father of a 2-year-old, so I know how long that time takes. And the interesting thing is that play is an essential part of that. Not just to kind of like use the physical, emotional, and also cognitive aspects of it, but beside that, to also explore the scope of actions that you can even do. If you think about it, if humans were not able to play, that would mean that everything we do would have an immediate sanction. That would mean if you would always have the end result of something, you know, if you wouldn't have a play space to realize what it means to, you know, try something out, climb on something, fall of it. If you always die when you do that, learning would be very hard. And the playful aspect of exploring these things is an essential part of what even makes us humans. If we wouldn't have play space, we would not be who we are. So playing is the anthropological condition for our well-being and learning. And that is a really important aspect, that we are humans through play and through learning. Otherwise, we would be babies that cannot survive. The question is, how do learning and playing interrelate and interdepend? And a really beautiful example is the one with Bernhard Suits. He says there's a very interesting sport that we all love here called golf. Golf is, when you think about it, if you think about the game of golf, it has a very simple rule. You put a very tiny ball into a hole. And if you think about it, that action would be very simple. You could just take the ball and put it in the hole with your finger, like just let it fall and fall into the hole. That is kind of like the result of the rule. If you really would take that game as simple as it is, that's how you would play it. The interesting thing is, we make the ball as small as possible. We take an iron stick. We put the hole far away from where we want, where the ball is. And this game is all about failing. You constantly fail, and people measure how often or less often you fail to get that ball in, which doesn't make any sense. It just makes a very simple action very complicated. If you compare to this, and I know this is very different in America, jobs are very different. In jobs, some people besides Americans and scientists try to make things as easy as possible. If you tell them after 30 years that from now on their job is completely going to change, they hate that because they like routines. They would really like if you would offer a person a paycheck at the first of the month without having to work. Some people, you wouldn't believe it, take that. Yeah, you don't, but they do. The interesting thing is, in the real world out there, in real life, we often try to make things as simple as possible. We pretty much want to put the ball in the hole and make the hole as big as possible and the ball as small as possible and just have it dropped in without any effort. So the question is, why do we play games where we make simple things harder while we in real life try to make hard things simpler? And so this is an interesting question. And one thing that Bernhard Suits says about this, he says, playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And my contra to that is living is the involuntary attempt to overcome necessary obstacles. And this gets really close to what the problem is. In life, our obstacles are necessary. It's something that we are confronted with, maybe with our lives or financially or physically or whatever. We are not in a free game space. In games, the moment we get in a free game space where I can explore my actions, I suddenly want to have things more complicated, which means I really want to learn how to solve the problem. Otherwise, it's boring. And here we come to the core potential of games for learning, that through learning, games get interesting. If we can immediately play a game, because it's so simple, all the games you guys talked about today, some are harder. Dark Souls is, for instance, extremely hard. Some are easier, but none of them is completely dull. None of them is so easy that you just press a button and that's it. That would be boring. So, and Bernhard Suits in his book, The Grasshopper, even goes further and says, what if in the future we would live in a world where everything is done by robots? See, I even get the cyber thing in. It's beautiful. So if everything would be done by robots, everything I wish for, like this, is happening, what would happen? And he says, that's what's going to happen. We will start to work with our hands again. If you can have a house like this, probably you want to build it with your hands. Because, and I think it's a really interesting point. If everything can be done like this, that would mean that there's no challenge in that anymore. So we kind of like can have everything that is necessary. So his theory is we will really gamify, in that sense, everything and really start to learn hard and work hard again, just because now we can. And if you look at people that have hobbies, most of the time they work hard for that, but they don't feel like that. They really enjoy it, and they really want to improve in that area. So that was the introduction. Now we're going to have a section where I talk about learning dimensions in games and learning in general, what it means for games, and how it could be used in classrooms. And that's the new part. As I told you, my research is focusing on learning anyway. But there is a new study called The Nature of Learning. I'm not sure if anybody here knows that. It's an OECD study that is collecting what are the major insights from contemporary learning theories. And what they do is they invited different researchers to talk about their aspects, and then they did a really good job of kind of like nailing it down to the core principles. What does learning in the 21st century really mean? And I'm going to use that structure now to think about what that means for video games. So I'm going to focus on 7 dimensions of learning, and I'm going to give you 2 extra that come from my research as a bonus. So the first one is a personal dimension. What does that mean? I'm not sure if you know that. Does anybody here know what that is?
Tarot?
Yes, you're completely right, but what is on it? Does that, see, you guys don't even know what that is. Isn't that beautiful? Because that is a Nürnberger Trichter. It is the image of a very traditional learning style. So that means knowledge comes in here, falls into the pupil's head. You know, the interesting thing is this is an understanding where pupils are pretty much you know, like whole heads that you fill with knowledge that the older generation has and the younger doesn't have. I still believe that a lot of e-learning discussion is still approaching learning in this way. Learning is a very subjective process. You can never take it away from anybody. So I think, you know, people still want to invent microchips that you can just put in your head and have all the knowledge there. But I say you still kind of like work with a metaphor like this if this is what you're going to go for. So the personal dimension shows that the learner is at the center. So what does that mean? In the study they say that in a learning environment, the learner has to be at the center, and the activity that the learner is undertaking to develop an understanding of the world and to learn is an essential part of modern learning theories. So kind of like we go away from this idea of linear instruction, and we want to go to where's the learner in his or her learning process. So what does that mean for video games? When we look at video games, we quickly find in every game the player is at its center. In a game, you are always the star. You are never, you know, like a number, or you're never a minority. And that's, for instance, very interesting reasons why a lot of kids that are in the puberty love video games, because there they are in power. And we all have been in puberty. That's the moment you realize you're nothing. Nobody cares about you, you know? Really, you're like the smallest thing. You don't even earn money. And in that moment, to find games where you are the star, and even, it's interesting, even shooters, for instance, where you're not even the stars, but you even have a big gun, and the whole environment is kind of like shaking under you, is a really interesting place to go when you're just realizing where you are in the world. And I think we all kind of like did that, you know. Now it's video games is a space, and before that other people found other media forms like, you know, music or drugs or other ways to kind of like explore their limits and the limit of their generation. Beyond that, players experience self-efficacy, and that's a really interesting learning aspect of video games. Most pupils, when they're in school, they don't think that they are kind of like in charge of their learning. They don't feel that they have efficacy about what's going on. They kind of like are drilled for tests to repeat knowledge. They're never really in charge. In games, you have the feeling of being fully in charge of what's going on, to be really to experience a strong feeling of self-efficacy. I'm later going to show you a study where it's a really great example what happened there. And the progress in the game reflects your learning process, and that's really interesting. So that means if you get better in a game, that pretty much means you learned how to do that. And games live from that. You never want to have a game that is pretty much always staying on the same level, because it's boring. You want a small improvement in a small bite where you don't feel it really, but when you look back, you realize, wow, like now, you know, look how I can solve that level. Interesting side effect is the illusion of learning in games, which is very recent research. So in a game, what you sometimes can do, so let's say you play a shooter and you go through the first level, and it's hard. You fail 45 times, and suddenly you can master level 1, and you even make it through level 2, and then you get a power-up. What does that mean? So suddenly, if you would play level 1 now, it would be very easy because now you have a big gun. The funny thing is it doesn't feel like that. It feels like you got really better in level 1, but it's not true. You just have a very big gun. And that is a problem that is occurring in some video games, especially in shooters, but in every game where you can pretty much buy or get items that you can now, from now on, just use. And that is a very interesting problem that a lot of kids don't even realize, that they are probably sometimes even worse than they have been in the game. They just think that they're much better. And by the way, Demon Souls and Dark Souls, for instance, in Demon Souls, it's a game where, that was the one that was going before Dark Souls, it's a game where you pretty much have a learning process like a human. So if a big dragon comes, what should you do? In video games, you normally go there and smash the dragon. In Demon Souls, you run for your life. And you probably run for half an hour and hide and shake under a stone till the dragon just passes you. And the message of that game is pretty much, that's how humans should behave when a dragon comes. It is almost, for video game players, that game is impossible to play because they're like, what's going on here? You know, like that doesn't make any sense. But it's a really interesting way to show how gamers also experience this kind of like powering up and being strong and being in power, and also this illusion of being in power. So what does that mean for classrooms? So one important aspect is that players never reflect on the learning path in a game. They just get better and better and better, but they don't sit there and realize how much better they got, what they have learned, and how they have learned it. So this could be, for instance, one very strong aspect in this first dimension of learning, to work with them on how they even learn something and what that means for their learning in general. What I always find interesting, you have kids out there that probably know every American football player by heart, probably know their skills, their teams, their colleges, they know the tactics of certain teams, but if you tell them when the Second World War stopped, they cannot remember it after a week, which is just one number, because it doesn't make any sense to them. And where we would say, well, you know, like that's quite important, for them, the number or which hand the player is playing the ball with is way more important. And they can remember that easily. How is it possible that the same kid that can remember everything in the game doesn't remember anything in the classroom? The problem is that, as I can already tell, what do you do now? Most teachers don't understand how to use knowledge about American football in the classroom. They don't see that it's kind of like a perfect example of how, you know, like if a kid tells you they cannot remember 5 numbers, you should really discuss with them how it is possible that they know everything about American football, or if they know everything that they use in their game that might not be usable. The problem is it's not easy to generalize, because every kid is playing different games, every kid has a different passion. When I work with teachers, I mostly realize they don't have any clue what their kids are even playing and how they're playing and how they're learning when they play. But I would say, for instance, in this dimension, it would be a big potential to get that into the classroom, pretty much about as a learning about the learning aspect. The second dimension they found in this new research study is the social dimension. In a classic understanding of learning, we still have the understanding if learners can learn in solitude, they can concentrate better. So kind of like this understanding of that we kind of like want to isolate students to really work hard, do their homework, and get kind of like good in the knowledge topic they're working on. But as we found out in recent studies, learning is a very strong social, it's about social interaction. So that means that the learning environment that people are learning in should be a strongly social environment. That means the idea of how people can work together is a really important aspect. And also in my own research, I realize the most meaningful learning experiences are the ones that we share with others in a direct or indirect way. So this potential is something that in 21st century has to happen in classrooms. The question now is, so what about video games? So, you know, are these games really social learning spaces? The first important thing is, and the parents here will probably know that, which is also an interesting problem. If you look at teenagers, most contemporary digital games have a strong social aspect. So, you know, like, for instance, you mentioned solitaire. It has an interesting component when you also realize what your friends, colleagues, or family, how they play the game, and if they even know how you play it. And solitaire is an interesting game because it's not about competition, it's more about the process. But today, you know, especially with Facebook and social media, people want to know what other people play and how they play it, what achievements they got. But they also play together online, and that's something, you know, like today, if you design a game, some games just fail because they don't have an online component. The interesting thing about that is players definitely learn how to cooperate. I'm not sure if you ever saw in World of Warcraft. Everybody here knows what World of Warcraft is? Very good. Has anybody ever seen like if a big massive fight in World of Warcraft?
I've done it.
You've done it. Yeah, so
40 men taking down all one thing.
Yes.
Yep.
If you think about that, so 40 people organizing themselves, that every person in respect to their skills does a certain thing to that dragon or whatever that is pretty much, I think not many companies in the world can do that. That at one point, like, I'm not sure if you ever had an online conference and people are like 15 minutes too late are suddenly there, and then like one, you know, goes in the restroom, the other one is constantly sipping coffee. But here to have 40 people, sometimes teenagers, to be there at the precise moments and to be fully organized to, for a certain amount of time, really do their thing and concentrate and help together and even be flexible to change if something happens is really impressive. And that's what games can definitely teach kids way better than a classroom can even do, because it's hard to simulate a problem like that. The interesting thing is, what video games don't do as a social learning space is kind of like really going for conflict. That's, you know, and it's the same thing with online space in general. If you dislike a person, or if you have a problem with a person, beside stalking when you broke up, most of the time you just avoid it. You know, the problem is if you dislike a colleague and you share an office, it's there all the time. You have to face it. You have to do something about it. But if you dislike a person in a video game or in World of Warcraft, you just, you know, join another group. And that is a really interesting problem, because these people think, wow, I'm such a social person. Look how many online friends I have. The problem is, how many online friends do you have that you really dislike, that really go on your nerves or that disrespect you? How do you handle that? So one research we did, for instance, in a project called Hate Speech. Did you see that when you were there? So, for instance, we gave a player in Xbox Live, I would say, a very obvious name indicating their race and their sex, and also their sexual interest, and that person, it was about being black and gay. The interesting thing is, how do people talk to that person online? And we just collected all the data we found in 24 hours of gameplay. And it's, I think it was a 4-hour readout of constant, judgments and really terrible language about that person. And the interesting thing is, there is no discussion out there, you know, and I think, you know, some projects that you did are hinting in that direction too. But it was really astounding how there is no form of communication there. And, you know, if school doesn't do something, that could be a space where you really even have a conversation about that. And that brings me to the question, what can schools do about the social dimension of play? There is the potential to foster social interaction in classrooms, because now kids can really interact with each other. You can moderate conflicts that they would just avoid in the online space. In the online space, they just click the person away. But what if you even, you know, take that conflict and bring it to the classroom, or moderate it just with the people that are there, and realize that there is a dimension beyond the online space where a certain conflict has to be communicated and solved. The interesting problem we have here is teachers are not natives in the video game sphere. They are intruders. And that is really sad. Like, often when I have colleagues that work that are like the cool colleagues that work with students or kids online, or for instance they use Facebook for class, they have the feeling, wow, I'm there, you know, like I'm with them, but the kids exactly know what to communicate, and they kind of like see the teacher as an intruder into their space. And that is definitely a problem we face right now that is not solved. How are we even handling that? If the teacher is with the kids, does she spoil the whole space, and they just want to go somewhere else? That's also something where you also have to find a certain respect, or ways of maybe interacting without directly playing with them, or, you know, figuring out how that even works. A further one is that teachers are often unfamiliar with the social codes that are happening online. You know, they go into space and don't understand how people are communicating, or they don't even respect what's going on. And quickly, you know, like it's really interesting to see. Even you can write a sentence online or say a word, and people immediately know who you are, and if you belong here or not. And that is a future problem where we need more education and have to work with teachers on also understanding that sphere if they want to use it for learning. The third dimension is a motivational one. So, you know, away from this kind of like isolated kid that is working with a book to a social, emotional, and motivational process of learning with interesting, engaging materials. In the study, all the studies show that motivation, learners' motivation, is a really important part. You cannot just by using power structures make a person learn, because that works in short term. If you really want to have a change, you have to really make them motivated. You know, we don't even have to talk about that, I think, with games. Getting attention is what video games are best in, you know, like, and we all know that. It's impressive. You can play a video game and you really forget what time, like how much time was spent. You probably, even if you had a bad day while you're playing, you don't feel it because you have to be too focused on that to really start to get depressed about it. Which again is for teenagers a very good reason to go there. Immersion in learning challenges. That means learning is such an integral part of games that they don't even realize that they do it. The interesting thing is also because we don't care at all about what they're learning, which gives them the freedom to explore that. Which might be an interesting problem at MIT. We're right now designing a World of Warcraft about science. And that will be, for instance, interesting if anybody's interested in a World of Warcraft about science. Because sometimes I also realize that the kids are happy to have a private sphere. It's kind of like, don't tell anybody I'm learning here all the time, you know, because they would use it against me. So we'll see how that works out. And when you play games, you're intrinsic motivated. So that means it's really your wish to do something and not, you don't do it for somebody else. What is very important, and people often forget, that nobody can learn for somebody else. You always have to learn for yourself. And I'm not sure, the interesting thing about it, when you get older, you not that often have to learn something that you don't want to learn. But if some of you are sometimes in these training programs, or, you know, I don't know what it is, something you have to learn, you're not interested in, it feels weird. Like, you know, the good thing about being a researcher, you kind of like also choose what you do. But I just had to do, I don't know what it was. I think it was an ethical test for my research, where you just kind of like learn standards of how to do surveys with kids. And I felt really bored. And I was, hey, I kind of like, oh, I forgot how it feels to have to learn something that is not really interesting to you. And even if the topic was important to me, the way it was communicated was so boring. And I was like, oh, you know, I remember that. Like that, you know, that was how it felt in school. In games, you don't have that at all. It's always intrinsic motivation. The interesting problem we have is flow versus reflection. Flow is the state when you're kind of like in between what you can do and cannot do. It's something that comes from jogging. When you run a marathon and don't realize anymore that you're running, and you kind of like are out of power, but you're just running. It's kind of like the end of the marathon. You're in a flow state. That is pretty much the perfect state of being capable of doing something and improving constantly without realizing it. That's what happens in game a lot. The interesting thing is you don't reflect on flow, because that wouldn't be flow anymore. So that means you are in a flow state, but that also means you cannot reflect on how you learn right now, how you improve yourself. And that already hints over to what teachers can do. So I would say the reflection of the experience is something that could be a great potential for teachers to use, because kids cannot, in this situation, reflect on their learning and their experiences. So that is a big potential to get that in. The immersion of learning challenges is impressive. So if you have a game that kids really engage with, it's a form of intention and immersion you can hardly do in a normal educational setting, because they kind of like really forget where they are. Just imagine, you know, somebody would, you kind of like test kids, and then like the bell rings and they just go on, not because they didn't finish, just because they're so immersed. And like, oh my God, that math problem is so interesting. I really want to stay over the break and, you know, work on it a little bit more. And one example I often give, games, every time you're good in a game, it gets harder. And imagine if, you know, that is an exam. it's like a nightmare. Like kids have the nightmare, I think, that the moment you're able to solve the problem, the teacher comes and gives you a harder one, and it goes on and on and on, would be a nightmare in school. It's exactly what kids do in their games. The problem is, how can you translate that to extrinsic motivation? The problem is our school system is not just designed for what kids find interesting. It's sometimes stuff where the older generation says, we think the younger generation should learn that. And so the motivation is extrinsic in terms of tests, in terms of certain goals in the curriculum you want to teach. How can you combine that? How can you make an extrinsic goal and an intrinsic goal? And that is what a lot of educational games are about. And that's really tricky, especially if the kids smell that that just happened. Often it's better to even tell them, well, that's an extrinsic goal, and here is a game that handles that. Look if it's interesting to you. It's not good if you say, no worries, that's not an educational game. Oh, you really learned math by that. I'm so sorry. They know that and they get that. The problem is in this motivational dimension, and already in the ones that I mentioned, is the role of a teacher here is a different one that we're used to. It's not a teacher that comes prepared with answers that he or she is, instructing, and then they have to repeat it. It's a person that comes in and has no clue what's going to happen next, because the game space is such a quick one and such a moving one that the teacher has to be somebody who is more or less raising questions and working with questions than really kind of like teaching answers. When you use games, you're not the person who's going to teach answers anymore, because the games are way better in that, and they do it in a different way than you do it. And that is something that teachers were not prepared for. They're not trained to do that yet. The fourth dimension is the subjective dimension. And it is also about kind of like realizing the learner is not just a number. It's about the personality. It's really about the divergence between the learners. It's about individual differences among learners, and also how their prior knowledge is related to what they do. And that is really essential part of understanding kind of like, again, the learner in the center and how he or she learns. And in a game, the interesting thing is, yes, there are always skill differences, and they know that. They're very, when players know that everybody kind of like has a different skill set, and the interesting thing is they don't even judge each other that much about it. It's kind of like, okay, you're there, I'm here, doesn't really matter, but we engage in the same game space. You can, in games, express certain differences, because, you, for instance, can choose characters or use certain colors or names. The problem is, there's also, again, a bit of an illusion of diversity. Because, as I mentioned already in the hate speech project, yes, you can be a bit diverse, and you can probably choose a different name. But if you are, for instance, have other sexual interests than random, like, than most people, or if you have anything that is kind of like different than the group, you're a little bit in trouble in a lot of games. And there is not a lot of conversation going on about what about the otherness in video games. And beyond that, game spaces are not inclusive by nature. They can be and they should be, but they're not. It's pretty tough out there. And it is something, again, where I would say the school could be an interesting space. Teachers or educators can really play a role here in problematizing that and talking with the players about that. So if you look at the educational space, the role of women in video games is in many cases still highly problematic. So if you look at racing games, for instance, the girls are the ones that are running around with the flags while you pimp up your car. And in sports video games, for instance, still, try to have a women team on your FIFA game. You will not find it, and that is interesting because how is that possible? In the Olympic Games, they also play, so what's going on here? Teachers could use the games to acknowledge not only the different skill levels that people have and also realize where are you, for instance, when you learn math in your game, but they can also offer room for critical reflection of certain differences between players, cultures that normally don't get articulated in the game space. Because games are not designed to have that conversation going on. Problem is, one example we have is once Adobe created an interesting math game that they tested in the classroom. And what happened is that after a week of playing, most of the kids had extraordinary learning experiences. Bless you. But the problem is, if you normally go in a math class, there's a teacher kind of like going through the content based on the curriculum, and you go for an average pupil. You go for the middle. That doesn't exist. But you pretty much want people to be around the middle, and some are better and some are worse. Interesting problem with video games, if you play a math game for a week, you have 30, or how many kids you have there, different skill levels. That might be one kid might be in grade 8 in math, and the other one might be in grade 6. So teachers are extremely afraid of that situation, because suddenly it means, oh my God, you know, like I cannot do my normal instruction anymore because they're all over the place now. And that is an interesting problem. The classrooms are designed to teach an average and a big group of people. Games are designed to always go for best possible and for each individual. And that is an interesting clash, but it's not about a clash that asks what is the best learning thing here. It's one of organization and power structures, which is the one that you can organize. But I would say I would not like to give up the game space just because school systems are not ready for it. You know, it might take a certain time till this happens, but I would say it just shows classrooms that they are not ready for this form of learning yet. And as I already mentioned, you have to be able to ask questions where you don't have the answer probably, and you need the kids to also bring in their experiences, which is hard for a lot of teachers. The fifth dimension is the constructive dimension. So to go away from a not challenging form of teaching and learning to one that really gets you to challenges and to constructive, like to really go on the edge of your competence. So hard work and challenge without excessive overload is an important aspect of contemporary learning environments. What does that mean in terms of games? So this here, for instance, does anybody here know Minecraft? Yeah? So Minecraft is pretty much like Lego for in the digital world. One could say you can pretty much build everything, but you have to build it piece by piece. So that's the Sagrada Familia from Barcelona that somebody built in this world. And you have to build every single thing by piece. That means this is hundreds and thousands of hours of work on this building. And there are really interesting examples out there what people have built in that space that you can also share and invite people, and you can go there and look at it. So games are perfect in balancing skill levels. If somebody just wants to build a small hut in Minecraft, that's fine. If you want to build that, that's also fine. You can get pretty much everything you want. Yes?
It's a shame that the RTTF, the video fellow, left, because this game is the most addictive I've ever experienced, and it's lo-fi.
Yeah.
So he was wondering, you know, are we ever going to get high enough fidelity for the kids in the
Yeah.
learning? But I don't think it's about fidelity. It's about this constructive aspect.
Yes, and I think an important aspect, thank you that you mentioned that, is also you might find it extremely addictive and interesting, and other people like, no, I'm not interested in that part. So I think, and that is also important, some people are not interested in the constructing element of learning and of playing, which is completely fine. But for a big group, it is extremely motivating to do that. And what we find really impressive is Minecraft was not intentionally designed that people will build stuff like that. And you find you can go online and find stuff that people have created.
Built like levels of other games
Yes.
into it, like reconstructions.
Yes.
So you can play through.
And you also find interesting drama, like when because the whole thing can also be set on fire. Have you ever seen that one when like stuff burns down and people are like, oh my God, it's like and then they stare when 1,000 hours of work burns down in front of them. So you can even watch drama. Yeah.
The thing that really got me about this game is that I've got a 10 or 11-year-old nephew.
Yeah.
And I was showing him because I'm interested in that. And he picked it up. Then 6 months later, I go and see, and he's got some of his friends around, and two of them, unrelated to us, dude, I'll catch you Minecraft tomorrow or tonight.
Yeah.
You know, like it's like a play. It's like the place.
Yeah.
To go and hang out.
Yeah. And it's a very it's a very pixelated. It's an because we also talked about aesthetic preferences. It's an awful game in terms of very pixelated. The sun looks like 10 pixels or something because everything is a block. It looks like Lego. So it's not a hyper cool world, but it just turned out to be that because people created stuff like that. But if you go in that world, you will find it hard to build a small block in the beginning, and then you realize what it means that somebody is able to do stuff like that. Yes, and the interesting thing is something that we call sorry.
Sorry to interrupt.
No worries.
I'm curious. These dimensions and a lot of this research has it been collected on K through 12 populations
Yes.
mainly, and how much? I mean, quick answer, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm interrupting, but how much has been done on higher education or even adult learning communities, or is it most of it focused on?
Yes. This study, I would say, pretty much focused under 18. I think there's still the challenge. Like, yes, I totally hear you. Like, I think not enough. Because, you know, the average gamer now, as they say, is 34 in age. And I think, yes, I would say, you know, when it comes to games, there's hardly any research on people above 40. And the learning, like the OECD study, mainly it also involves different studies, but mainly on pupils and school kids.
Do you feel like this K through 12 population data is applicable to a higher ed population, given different intellectual maturation, blah, blah, blah?
Yes, I would say, as the colleague already mentioned, I would say in its core, yes. Yeah. It might show a different picture, you know, because I know a lot of colleagues that now play Minecraft, yeah. And that's, I think, also interesting because you choose who you play it with. So, for instance, like in my lab, we have one common Minecraft space where people create, and there are no kids there, you know. Yeah. But you could also have the same game where kids are pretty much playing around, very childishly. Where, like, you know, all the dudes would be like, no, like that's, you know, that's just childish. So I would say that is also interesting how these spaces are used differently, and how that core essence might look different for adults. So, so for instance, when I mentioned Zoo Tycoon before, Zoo Tycoon, there was the experience I had with a dolphin, is a zoo management game. And I know a family where the dad is managing a zoo, and what you also can do is you can go in the zoo and work in the zoo as, you know, like cleaning animals. So you can go in there, and it saves money for the manager. So, for instance, and how they play is the dad is managing the zoo, and then the kid goes in there, cleans animals, plays with the animals, and it even, you know, is good financially for the dad because he doesn't have to hire a person for cleaning the animals. And I think that's a really interesting thing where they learn differently about the game. They play together, but in different, you know, ways, I would say. Yeah. The problem that, you know, I think we all realize here is often the content is not applicable to what most people learn in schools. And I think that is, of course, an interesting problem. Who cares if you can build something like that in Minecraft? You might still have an architecture class where your teacher doesn't even have a clue that you're capable of that, because there is no space to express that. And again, I think this also comes down that most teachers don't yet realize how to use the learning that is happening in games in classrooms, and the funny thing is often the players also don't realize it. So we kind of like have two people involved that don't realize the potential that is really going on here. And I also have to say the translation will not be easy. It's not, you know, it's not clearly linear adaptable, and it's a big challenge to start thinking about how to even do that. Fifth is the constructive. Oops, sorry. So yeah, what does it mean for teachers? So one interesting part is, and I love that, the challenge in the game is always fair. So, you know, if a teacher does a test and the kid fails in it, the kid most of the time has the feeling of being treated unfair because that was too hard, or, you know what I mean? Like, it's always like the others are wrong. I wasn't able to do that, but kids often, like, it's seldom that they say, well, I was not capable of doing that. It's often, that test was too hard for me. The interesting thing is, in a video game, you're constantly challenged, but it's always fair. It's a computer. You know, that thing doesn't take you personal. It just says, you're able to do that, so now you should be able to do this. Or you're not, do it again. You're not, do it again. You're not, do it again. But I find it very interesting, especially with kids that have learning disabilities, that often you really freak out if they're not able to do something. In a video game, they are calm. They do it again and again and again because they know the system is not tricking me here. It's treating me fairly. Yes, you can use hard fun for informational learning. So as the game I mentioned, Zoo Tycoon, is very clear because the Microsoft Encarta is included. But you can use the learning potential in the game, in the classroom, if you're able to translate it, which is very hard. And that already brings us to the problem. Not all good games are usable yet in learning and teaching contexts. So again, NFL, yeah, it's good if a kid can does know every football player out there and every tactic and everything. But does it make you better in playing football? By the way, interesting research question. So a lot of games, a lot of learning that is happening is kind of like happening in the wild out there, and it's very hard to use it in a school. And a major problem that we find is the timing issue. And I will tell you, this is probably the hardest part. Teachers use a certain structure, and 45 minutes, 40 minutes is, for instance, a very strong school structure. 40 minutes in a video game is nothing. It's a joke. It's like, oh, like I don't. You're thinking of your son. You're like, oh my god.
Pops up to eat and go to the bathroom.
Yes. And I fully understand. The problem is, and then this idea of I'm coming, and then for him or her it might be 5 emotional minutes, which are 55 minutes of real time. And this is, for instance, an essential problem that we find when we use games in schools, is there are not a lot of games that you can play like this, and you can, like, after 45 minutes you have your learning experience, because most people are just starting to get into the game. That also means, how can you design a game that is interesting after 1 second? So, for instance, Minecraft, after 45 minutes, you probably know how to walk, or how you can dig. That's it,
First night.
Yeah, or yeah, you. So it's really hard, and it's really so there are games that are now designed to really be playable in 40 minutes and different chapters, but also a question is if you also have to break, for certain subjects. If you really want to use a game, you probably have to break and say, we're going to do 3 hours now of playing and reflecting this game, and often the school system is not ready for that, and teachers don't want to do that. And I also realize it is really strange, and I'm going to show you a study that we did and show you what teachers even thought about that. The 6th dimension is the contextual dimension. So the question is to get away from a very abstract, content-orientated learning to one where you situate what you learn, where you see the learner as a responsive subject and who contextualizes everything, and where all the assessment you're doing is kind of like an understanding of who the learner is, where she is, and how he or she contextualizes what's going on. And that is a really, I think assessment is a whole topic on its own, because the assessment that they are talking about is one where you more realize where the learner is in his or her learning process, not one where it's just about the results of that learning. Just that I say that learning is process, not result. So what about the contextual dimension of games? And so the interesting aspect is learning assessments implemented in every game, because that's how you know that you improved. Feedback is a really driving factor in games, because you constantly get feedback on your learning process, in form of assessment, in form of achievements, but sometimes also just in form of levels or accuracy you get. The feedback is always used to improve you, to make sure, this is where you are now, wait, now it's getting even harder for you. But the recontextualization of that, kind of like to put that into another context, is not game immanent. And that means we also can come back to the violent discussion here. Games are not designed to make you violent. Games, off-the-shelf games, are not designed to make you cleverer. They are often designed to make you buy it, And this is really important. It's the good news for the ones that are afraid of video games in terms of violence. They're not really good in doing that. It's also the bad news for the ones that want to use it for education in terms of the game itself doesn't do that. It's not designed for that. It doesn't. The designers don't care if that person afterwards can use it somewhere else, because that is a dimension that they cannot think about. And it also leads over, so for the educational potential that it would have. Teachers could use the assessment aspect of the game and kind of like to see where the player is in the subject, where their learning process is kind of like happening right now. But they can also recontextualize that feedback. They can recontextualize, they can put it in context again, what is happening in the learning here. So for instance, as I mentioned in Zoo Tycoon, you can learn a lot about biology, but if kids don't get the connection between what they learn in the game and what is out there in the curriculum or in real life, they're kind of like missing that part, and they pretty much need a teacher or somebody assisting them to do that process. They have to have somebody who can relate the context in a new way. If that's not happening, the learning is just staying within the game, and nobody might care about them, or parents are even worried about that aspect. The problem is that this learning process in game is process-orientated, not so much result-orientated. So yes, you get your feedback, and you get your yes, you're able to do this now, and you get your points, but it is part of a whole thing. So one thing that I realize, a lot of teachers are very, grading focused. So they're like, hey, okay, now my kid can learn math through that game, but how do I grade that? And then they're like, oh, cool, I realized that, after each level, you see where the person is, I just grade that, and you destroy it. It comes back to the whole game space idea. The moment you play a game and the moment you reach the level, somebody grades you, it's not a game anymore. Because all the freedom you had to explore is suddenly gone. That means that the teachers also have, and that's the reason why I kind of like repeated that point, that potential that the learning is process-oriented is also the problem in the school suddenly, because it's not applicable directly to form how it is assessed. Yes, and again, this recontextualization, to put that into context, is a hard challenge for teachers to master in their schools. Often they don't even know the games, and often they don't know how to contextualize the games back into the classroom. But that is the big challenge. The final dimension from the study is the connective dimension that already hints into the direction. So you can teach kids about how America was invented or how foreign policies work, but if they really understand what America means in other countries, is if they go there and realize that everybody knows McDonald's and eats the food, and for instance certain images about America that are out there through TV or whatever. So to kind of like get away from an isolated knowledge factor driven thing, to also kind of like connect it to what that even means for people, what it means for the pupils and their learning. So it's very important, this horizontal connectedness between subject areas of the kids. So in terms of the game, what does that mean? So for instance, this is a game called Civilization. Anybody here? Okay, so Civilization is pretty much a simulation where you are playing a certain part of history. You take over, you're kind of like playing a country, and you kind of like see how education, politics, economy is driving the development of a country, and you can play different areas, like in history parts, you can play different time phases of the world, and understand it's a very complex game where you learn a lot about history and societies. And you can also connect a lot to other players and discuss that and all that aspect. The problem is that Civilization is also a very bad history game, because a lot of aspects that happened that didn't get kind of like placed in the game are not mentioned. So I realize a lot of kids that play a lot of Civilization think, wow, I'm so good in history, I know everything. But they don't understand that the designers of Civilization had to focus on 10 aspects. So they kind of like reduced history to a system that can pretty much be run with 10 elements of gameplay. but often real life is way more complicated than that. Often people do things that don't make any sense to anybody in history. My country was very good at that, for instance. But and to understand that a game is not a good thing, because games, as I mentioned, are always fair. And if you're completely stupid, you will just lose. In real life, you can be really stupid and win. History has taught us this. The connections are not reflected. Games are not designed to connect to real life. And one aspect that is very at my heart is transfer is not transformation. Even if you get a transfer in, it doesn't transform you as a human yet. So it doesn't really change the way you think about yourself, others, in the world, just because you can suddenly transfer the knowledge to a different domain. It doesn't really change you as a human. And that's something, for instance, that I research a lot, is how people change the way they think through games. And that only happens if they also can relate to their lives and who they are as people. And often that is contextualized, but a lot of subjective experiences that suddenly make a moment where they really shift the way they think about something. A game doesn't do that. It's the human that does that. So for teachers, to finalize this, it means players and teachers can play an essential role in connecting the dots. And I would also say if teachers or educators or other players don't do that, most of the time it isn't done at all. Not a lot of players are that critical that they suddenly, after playing Civilization, start a whole discussion about politics. You know, they start a discussion probably about a certain challenge that they couldn't master, or a trick how they did, but they don't talk about politics in general with the other players. Yes, teachers can create transformative learning spaces where they suddenly take the learning from the game and really reflect it with each other. The hard part is that's definitely something that teachers are not trained to do. You know, they were trained to teach history. They were not trained to suddenly articulate issues that pop up about history in a game. But oh my God, that would be a potential. If you suddenly know everything about history, and you really know all the dates, and you know who the big leaders of the world were, and what terrible things have happened, but suddenly somebody comes and says, oh, by the way, it's way more complicated than that. And kind of like gives you some facts and data that just complicates things and makes you ask questions the game cannot answer. You have a completely different form of connecting the dots here. So this brings us to the +2 dimensions, and we're almost finished with the lecture part of today. Learning by failure. As you know, that was my PhD, but I think it's something that games teach us a lot about learning. So show me that person that is motivated by an F in a test. You know, you will not find a lot of people that are like, oh, I just failed in my driving license. Americans, I think it's very hard to fail in your driving license. I changed that. You failed?
No, I'm saying it's ridiculous.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know how hard it is in Austria.
It is pretty hard.
Ours is like 22 lessons.
Yeah, no, ours is hard. Ours take like 2 months, and you have to drive for an hour, and we know it.
And no mistake, one mistake, and you
and that's it.
Right?
And it costs you a few $1,000s to do it again. So people are very nervous about this. But you know, think about any test. When you fail, it's devastating. It feels terrible. And you just don't want to do it again at all. You just do it if you have to. And you know, it could be that a C motivates you to get a B or an A, but an F, a failure, doesn't. Interesting thing is, this game over screen motivates people a lot. It's like, oh, I completely failed. Awesome. You know, I want to do it again. If they never fail, they don't think this game is interesting. You know, because failing, doing it again, improving is an essential part of play. The learning by failure is really engaging in games. It's awesome. It's cool. It can also sometimes be devastating, especially, you know, as I mentioned in Minecraft, if your building burns down. That might be a form of learning you don't want to have. But most people will then build another thing and just watch out that they don't burn it down this time. People readjust their skills and their knowledge. Yes?
I just want to add one more to that.
Yes.
Unplug. If somebody unplugs them.
Yes.
That's different. It's a different reaction in game mode that they choose. The
Yes.
efficacy
Yes.
is totally different.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I think there is the definition. Some people define the difference of games as work. People don't do that anymore because workaholics proved us it's wrong, and money works really well. Then people said depression could be the difference of play, the form when you cannot move anymore. But I think a really interesting difference to play is, how do you even say that? What is the English word for a person that doesn't play with you? That kind of like just stands up and leaves you on the table, pretty much. Spoilsport. A spoilsport is somebody that doesn't buy into the magic circle of the game.
Yes.
Somebody you played with and then it just leaves. If you plug out the power cord of your son's computer, it's kind of like the most disrespectful thing you can do for his passion. And it's really interesting because if you fight with him over, hey, it was 45 minutes, it's still a fight within his game space where he says, well, that's how my game space is structured, sorry for that. And you could say, well, dinner is over, that's how my game space is structured. But if you unplug the thing, or if the other person just stops playing, and that's the reason why in World of Warcraft, for instance, people will not just leave the table. If you have 40 people out there in the world, all over the continent or the world, that meet with you at this point of the time and let everything else go, and then one of them has to go to dinner because his or her mom calls, it would be extremely disrespectful for all the others. It would be kind of like showing that the game space is not worth anything. Or not, and that's a real interesting problem. It's enormous potential, but it also shows how people that don't understand the game space can have conflicts with the player in really profound ways.
And then they can choose failure. Some students choose failure in the game situation. They choose to lose. That's another interesting. We can talk about that again.
Yeah.
That's another one.
They explain it to me, please.
Well, they choose to fail because they don't want to embarrass themselves. Well, it gets into social dimensions, but the game may not be over, but they choose failure to get out of the game.
Oh, you mean so that they can leave the game space, pretty much? Yeah. That is a form where you still respect the game space, but kind of like take your way out. Yeah. Yeah. And again, but it's really interesting. There's a big potential here, and learning. I think I wrote my PhD about learning through disappointment. Disappointments are the perfect learning environments. We just hate it. Nobody wants to go for a disappointment. We avoid it every day. We always hope that our expectations are right. But if you have a disappointment, it just tells you are wrong. It's kind of like the solution to your problem. We just think the problem has just started. But if you look at it from a learning perspective, it is perfect. But again, that shows that learning is something that humans sometimes even try to avoid. In games, we don't. The problem is that we find that a lot of gamers choose challenges that they're already familiar with. And that is an interesting problem. A lot of players play the same games over and over and over and over. They buy the new shooter, they apply the new simulation that is pretty much the old one, a little bit harder, new graphics, and they feel really good in it. But they will not go into a new space where they might be challenged in a completely different way. And that, again, brings us to how teachers or educators or parents could use this space, is to really use that potential and also get them out of their genres and let them try different games, and use this learning through failure in games, this kind of like this big potential for learning. If you have a math game, it will be a game about failure in math that people engage with and have fun with. And that is enormous potential that is very hard to use in classrooms because it would be constant failure, and in classrooms it's not very fun to do that. The problem is teachers have to get out of the way, and not in general. I'm just saying if the game is doing its thing, you should, as a teacher, not interfere. You should find a space how you can use it, how you can moderate it, how you can probably contextualize it and connect it. But if you kind of like, okay, now again, like we plugged the thing, this was just a game, now let's talk about real math, that was it. And my second plus is the simulational dimension. I already mentioned that with Civilization. This, for instance, is a train game where you really can... I forgot the name of it. A friend of mine plays it extensively. It's a game where you can design railroads, but also like public transport, and you can even time buses and stuff. And people do that. People are redesigning the public transport of LA, and somebody is really calculating the minutes a bus should come and go, and you can imagine the complexity. So a lot of, like, you know, LA, does it even have public transport? Not even sure. But it kind of like shows how one player might solve a problem where a team of people is working on to improve public transport. So the interesting thing here is that games are sandboxes for learning. You can really explore a system. You can play around with it. You can tweak it. But beyond that, players can explore the impacts of their actions. That's really interesting. That's something we couldn't do before. So suddenly you can do something and then see what does it mean. I can see, goodbye, you could see what happens if I attack, what if Poland attacks Germany instead of the other way around. Might not be a good idea, and maybe it doesn't solve the problem, but you can see what would that even mean for the Second World War. But you can also see what does it mean if I change from buses to subways in a town or whatever. I can really explore a system and see what the impact is. And that is, by the way, something that humans are not very good in, as we know by treating our environment the way we do. We're like, hey, you know, as long as it's convenient, I'm happy to do something. But kind of like this understanding, I'm part of a system, and there's a reaction to what I do, is something that we now have tools that we can work with. But as I already mentioned before, but many systems also simplify the problems and just really nail it down to the core idea. And if you don't have somebody saying, yes, that might be true, but that game is a bit simplifying the whole system, but it could be a very good starting point to discuss these issues. And players cannot translate the system learning yet. So yes, you might, as I mentioned in Sudaikun in the beginning, you have somebody understanding everything about hamsters, but not getting the connection that they probably should walk their dog, you know, because it stays in the game space. They cannot fill the dots. So for teachers, that means this new dimension of teaching about systems is, I would say, something that has to be in the classroom. If you talk about anything that has any system relevance, how can you not use games or simulations in computers? Because it really shows the impact of your actions, and it's a really deep form of learning. But and the teachers can also support the application of the learning, as I mentioned, and really trying to understand what does playing history mean in relation to real history. But again, a novel challenge for teachers. Not something that they got prepared to do. Something where they have to understand the simulation too, and have to understand where the limits of the simulation is. So they really have to engage with that. And again, I would also say, and by the way, I think that's very important that I mention this, some teachers should please not use games. They should please do what they always do, if this is the best, if this is what they're best in. So a lot of teachers are bad teachers, and they think the moment they can introduce games, they can pretty much leave the classroom, and that is completely wrong. It is really important to see that there is a big potential, and I think for a lot of teachers it can be a potential, but it doesn't mean we have to change our whole educational system and everybody now has to use video games. Because I hope if you see that, there is big potential, but it also involves a new form of teaching and education that you have to be trained in, and that, you know, might not be everybody's thing. And I still think there are some teachers that if they give lectures, it's excellent, it just works, you know. And I heard there are excellent math teachers out there too. So I think it's just important to see that. So yes, there is big potential for learning games, but aspects like reflection, transfer, connection, and transformation is something that is not happening in the game. It's something that has to be educationally used to even get that potential out of games. These are novel challenges to the teachers, and we need a less linear form of instruction and a more circular form of teaching, where you kind of like develop questions with the pupils instead of teaching them a certain answer. And you combine that with normal forms of instruction. Teachers not trained to engage, teachers are not yet trained to engage with the play space. So I really see that for a lot of teachers that kind of like don't have an idea how to use it, it's very hard, and they need preparation for that, they need support. And I believe that teachers could bring the learning potentials to a completely new level of games that are yet not used. So this brings us to the point where I would like you to play some educational games. Who has got a computer here? would it be possible that sometimes 2 or 3 people can surround around one computer? So I just give you a very short explanation. Because we don't have a lot of time, I will probably lead you in the direction of playing 2 games, if that's okay. So this one here, I'm sorry, I will show you this is called Ludwig, but this might take too long to download now. So this is a physics game that can now be used. You pretty much learn, I would say, elementary school, which is age. Yeah? Okay, so I think it's 10 to 15. You pretty much learn everything you learn in physics in a game space. Ludwig, I'm going to write that down.
Did they finish the English translation?
Yes, they finished it. Yeah, for a reason it's written down here in black, which is very clever. I'm going to show you that. So this one is called Labyrinth. It's a game that's called also designed at MIT. It's a math game, but it's an interesting one where he tries to. So Scott's approach is he says what games are really good in is to make kids curious about something again. So this game is all about math and numbers without using math and numbers, but using abstract problems. It's all about monsters. But the interesting thing is, what he tries to show is that kids engage with this, and then teachers should make them realize that this is pretty much math. So that is an interesting game to play. What I also would like to, and I think these are the 2 I would probably recommend for today. So this one is called Wonder Mind. It's like an Alice in Wonderland game where you learn about brain science. You know, do you know that game? Mm-hmm. You're good. You should be here instead of me. And that's an interesting game, and there is a reason why I like that game. Not just because the content, it's also the style. A lot of games that are out there, I'm going to talk about that in a second, are so-called chocolate-covered broccolis. Not healthy, not tasty, and kids smell that. They don't like the games, how they look. And that game does a very good job in showing that you can make an interesting educational game that doesn't use AAA, 3D graphics, but is aesthetically pleasing. And I think that is a really important part of the games. I don't know why this is also in black. Which is this game is called Against All Odds. It's about immigrants. It kind of like puts you in the shoe of an immigrant. It's a so-called serious game. And then this is Folded. You probably have heard about this one. It's kind of like a game. Who has played Folded here? Anybody? How would you explain? How would you explain it?
It's a puzzler. I mean,
it's a puzzler.
Spatial
University
puzzler.
of Washington protein folding uses people to solve problems.